you've got to think, stand back. There is a bigger us, there is a bigger purpose. We've got to find a way of talking about the big picture, and the big picture matters.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to you from wherever you are around the world. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. My name is Luke. I am a producer here at How To Academy, and welcome to what I am sure is going to be a very special event. Today we are joined by Gordon Brown, Member of Parliament from 1983 to 2015, Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1997 to 2007, and of course Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. Gordon is now the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and Chair of the International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity. Gordon's new book, 7 Ways to Change the World, How to Fix the Most Pressing Problems We Face, is out now. Today, Gordon will be in conversation with Tom Fletcher. Having been a foreign policy advisor to 3 prime ministers, British ambassador to Lebanon, a visiting professor at NYU, and a best-selling author, Tom is currently a member of the EU Global Tech Panel at Hertford College, Oxford. So after a 45-minute or so conversation with Tom, Gordon is going to take questions from you, the audience. So please type any you have in the Q&A function, either at the bottom of your screen or at the top, I think, if you're on an iPad. Well, that's more than enough from me. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Gordon Brown and Tom Fletcher. Gentlemen, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Luke, and I'm really excited about this conversation tonight. Welcome everyone to Hertford College in Oxford. I wish you were here in person in the very heart of Oxford, in the place where activists and thinkers from Tyndale to Locke to Hobbes to John Donne have debated the future. And that's what we'll be doing tonight with this very, very special guest in Gordon Brown. I have to tell you 2 quick stories on Gordon Brown. One, Luke introduced me as a former foreign policy advisor to Gordon. My actual title was the private secretary for foreign affairs to the Prime Minister. And we were once in China, in Beijing, and Gordon asked me, why are the Chinese diplomats all laughing at your nameplate? And it turned out that my job title, the private secretary for foreign affairs to the Prime Minister, had been mistranslated as the intimate typist for the Prime Minister's affairs overseas. While I tried to do many things in support of this Prime Minister and others, I never did any intimate typing. But actually a more relevant story to tonight's discussion. We were sat there at the G20 summit in 2009, after the financial crash. The 23, it's a long story why it's 23 and not 20, leaders of the world in the room. And one of those leaders, the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, exploded and looked around the room and said, we're stuck. No one here has a plan. No one knows what to do. And there was silence, gloom, despondency in the room. And then Barak Obama, recently elected, leant forward and tapped his microphone and said, I think Gordon has a plan. And of course, Gordon Brown did have a plan in response to that financial crisis. And here again now, he has set out a plan for how we change the world in the future. So welcome, Gordon. It's brilliant to have you here. And as Luke says, we'll be looking out for questions in the Q&A as we go along. Gordon, I want to start actually, because we're in Oxford, I know you've been in touch with colleagues here about vaccines, and in particular how we can build on the success of the Oxford vaccine and the vaccination program more widely to start to vaccinate the world. How are we doing on that effort?
Yeah, first of all, can I say, Tom, what a pleasure it is to be on this broadcast with you. I'm sorry I can't be in Oxford with you at this event. As you know, I've always said that universities stand for rationality, objectivity, impartiality, the pursuit of truth, the search for knowledge. And I found that these were all the qualities I had to leave behind when I went into politics. So you know a bit about that as well. I want to start with vaccines, yes, because it's the most immediate issue. You know, when we were dealing with the financial crisis, it was clear what we had to do. We had to sort out the banking system. It had totally failed us. Now, when we're dealing with this crisis, it is vaccination that is going to get us out of this crisis, protecting people against the likelihood that the disease will lead to hospitalization and then death, not protecting people necessarily against having the disease, but against the consequences in hospitalization and death. And the tragedy is that having failed in the first year, when we just couldn't get our act together as a world, there was no exchange of information, The disease percolated right across the world. We didn't share the ventilators, we didn't share the PPE, we didn't really get our act together, and now 4 million people have died. We have had a chance, having found a vaccination, we had a chance to solve the problem. The genius was in the scientists like Sarah Gilbert at Oxford who invented the vaccines. We should be getting it around the world. It should be available to everyone. We should be making it possible for even the poorest countries to have it. And the tragedy at the moment is 3 billion vaccines have been produced, but only 1% of Africa is fully vaccinated. Only 3% of India, while we've been incredibly successful in Britain, America, and other countries, we've got a world which is half vaccinated or likely to be half vaccinated and half unvaccinated, half protected, half unprotected. And that is an ethical issue. It's also an economic issue because the world economy can't get back to normal until we get people vaccinated and ready to be able to work free of further lockdowns. And of course, it's an epidemiological issue because nobody is safe until everybody's safe. Everybody lives in fear until nobody lives in fear. And it's true that if we don't take action, it will come back to haunt us. It will mutate. We've already got variants, and then it will affect us all again. So even the richest countries are not protected as long as the poorest countries aren't. And so the great failure of these last few weeks is we had a G7 meeting, all the leading countries, the wealthiest countries in the world, and while they agreed to share the excess vaccines, that's not enough. It was about 780 million. We need 11 billion vaccines in total, and that just hasn't been provided. So what we're witnessing, again, is the failure of international cooperation. We know we're all affected. We know we're dependent on each other, but you've got to ask yourself, why is it that when the world's richest countries get round the table, we couldn't agree to make sure that we funded the cost of vaccinating the whole world? And it's relatively cheap, to be honest. It's about, I think we estimated about 30 pence per person in Britain, in the advanced countries, per week to be able to vaccinate the whole world. Not a huge cost at all, given the costs of what we are losing in production and jobs and everything else through not being able to get the economy back to normal. So this is a moral failure, and we've got to find a way of rectifying it.
So you used to always tell me to worry less about diplomacy and more about results. I think you're saying that the Cornwall summit then was, you'd grade that a fail, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I've been at lots of, you were giving the story of Nicolas Sarkozy at this summit in London in 2009. I've been at some ridiculous summits. I mean, I went to Paris, I think you might have been there, Tom, at the beginning of the economic crisis in 2008, when the banks were all collapsing around us. And we had all these people there. We had Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, Sarkozy, France, we had Berlusconi, Italy, we had the head of the central bank, we had the European Union, Barroso. We're sitting around a table, talk for an hour. I was actually saying, look, we've got a bigger crisis than you think, because it's not just America that's hit, it's going to be Europe that's going to be hit very badly. And then we broke up with them, and suddenly we had Berlusconi saying, amateurs, he said, amateurs. And we thought, here's Berlusconi, the businessman, politician. He's got all the solutions to this problem. Amateurs, he kept saying, amateurs. And then he said, don't they realize we've got a press conference in an hour and no leader has brought a makeup artist with them? And he was more interested in the image that we present than beginning to solve the problems. And so some of these summits are ridiculous because they get nowhere. Some can get somewhere, but you've got to have an agenda. You've got to force the agenda. You've got to be clear what you want to do. You've got, in a crisis, to get to the heart of the problem, but you've also got to be 2 or 3 steps ahead of events. You cannot be behind the curve. And too often in this crisis, we've been behind the curve, and we've got to learn lessons from that. We cannot afford another few years of prevarication and not getting to the root of the problem and getting things done.
I think that was also the summit where you went into a one-to-one with Van Rompuy, the head of the European Commission. And I said, you really need to go in with some tact and delicacy here, Gordon. And you came out afterwards and said, don't worry, I was very diplomatic. And out of the other door, Van Rompuy came and he was shaking, shaking like a leaf afterwards. But just actually...
Look, we've had some terrible debates in Europe, and that's one of the reasons why it's always been tension between Britain and Europe. I remember Delors, who was the president of the European Commission, telling me about Mrs. Thatcher. Now, Mrs. Thatcher presented herself as very anti-European, and he was, of course, very pro-European. And he kept saying to me, Mrs. Thatcher, she hates me. she hates me for 7 reasons. And he went through them: because I'm French, because I'm European, because I'm a socialist, a bureaucrat, a European. I can't remember the rest, but he said, she hates me for 7 reasons. So sometimes diplomacy is quite difficult, and sometimes people are very difficult to negotiate with.
So then, can I just get you to try to answer the question you posed then? I mean, why is it that we can't persuade the countries that do have the vaccines to do more? I mean, let me take you actually, Charlie Hancock from the Cherwell newspaper, who's one of our students here. She says, how are we going to spur action from the producers of the vaccines? Do you think that these new variants, the Delta variant and so on, will that make a difference? And how do we, when you've got those leaders in the room, what makes them change their minds?
I think what happened here was that they wanted to do something, but they'd underestimated the scale of the challenge. I think what's happened in the last year is that leaders have got themselves so locked into their national issues that they haven't understood that this is a global pandemic that cannot be solved without coordinated action. So they're very busy thinking about lockdowns, about quarantines, and they've got to think about that and how they vaccinate their own population, but didn't quite understand that unless you vaccinate every country, in every country, you can't solve this particular disease. And it was as true of smallpox as it is of now of this particular disease. So I think there was a lack of vision here, and I think this can be corrected at the G20. I mean, it's going to take weeks to be able to do this, but you can't have a situation where only 1% of Africa is vaccinated, maybe 2%, 3%. So you're not even vaccinating the nurses in the front line. You're not vaccinating the most vulnerable people. And so you've got to ramp up production. You've got to create a virtuous circle, but it starts with saying, we will fund this. We, the richest countries, are prepared to fund this. Then you will get a guarantee from the manufacturers that they'll ramp up capacity. Then you can get it into every continent instead of just 1 or 2 continents. And then you've got the supply that you need, because this looks as if it's not going to be a vaccine that's needed only for 1 year. It's going to be needed continuously to protect people against the disease. And so we've got maybe 3 months where in the next G20 meeting, which is the group of 20 leading countries, you said it's usually 23 that turn up at the meeting, and it was wrongly named the G20, but you've got this group of people meeting in Italy in October and November, and I think this is the time where you've got to make a decision. It would cost about $50 billion, but remember, President Biden alone has put $2 trillion up to save the American economy, and this is only a fraction of that shared between all the richest countries in the world. We've got a plan, we've got a burden sharing formula, it could be done, it's a question of political will now.
And when you look around that room, say around that table of 23, if the 7 can't do it, or at least the 10 leaders who go to the G7 summit, where do you see the leadership from? You mentioned Biden. Are we safely out of this Trump era now, out of this era of national distancing?
I think we've still got the danger of nationalism being the dominant ideology. I think President Biden has made a huge effort to re-engage multilaterally. But America used to operate multilaterally in a unipolar era. For the last few years, America has tended to operate unilaterally in a multipolar era. And I think President Biden wants things to move, but we've got to get some coordination with America, Europe, China in particular, but bringing in India, Africa, and Latin America, obviously, as well. And I think that's possible. You will never agree on everything. There are huge issues with China. Human rights is one of them that I never want to underestimate the importance of it and what we've got to say to the Chinese about the respect of human rights. But where you can agree in the interests of moving the world forward, I think you should agree. Climate change is one, vaccination and health policy is another, economic recovery is another. Now, if we could coordinate activity on these issues, as we did in 2009 for a brief period when we got the world out of a recession and prevented, I think, a depression, if we could do this now, I think you would show that cooperation works. And that would, of course, be the signal for cooperation perhaps to work in other areas too. John Kennedy was the president of America. He gave this great speech in 1962 in Philadelphia, the home of the Independence Declaration. He said, America had had a declaration of independence. We now need a declaration of interdependence. And that's really what we need, countries to recognize that our fate depends on others and we can't actually solve problems without working together. I was asked, you know, in the financial crisis, what do you take out of this? Is it not, it's the economy, stupid, which was an old phrase of Bill Clinton, you know, it's the everything revolves around the economy. And I said, no, I take out of this financial crisis, global problems need global solutions. And that's what we've got to think about.
You mentioned Bill Clinton there, and one of the questions in from the students is, you know, who would you want round that table? Who is in your dream G7 then? The leaders you work with, I suppose. Who did you most admire and why?
The leader I most admired, funnily enough, was never at a G7, around a G7 table that I was at, and that's Nelson Mandela. And the interesting thing about this leadership is, you know, Mandela was never an expert on detail. You know, if you'd gone to a meeting, he probably wouldn't have read most of the papers. I mean, I'm afraid. And that's not a good sign, of course, in normal circumstances. But he did have a clear vision. You know, he had a clear vision of a multiracial society in South Africa, and then a multiracial world. And he'd come to that through his long experience of being in prison. And, you know, the night before he left prison, he told me this when we met, and I think you were with me on one of the occasions I met Nelson Mandela, and I was very lucky to have a friendship with him, you know, after he came out of prison and for many years, and I'm still very friendly with someone who does a huge amount in the world, his widow, Gracia Michelle. But, you know, he called the prisoners together the night before he was released, and he said to them, look, we are going to be released tomorrow. We can go out and get revenge. These people have hanged our friends, they've executed, I myself, I think he explained, had tuberculosis. I was under threat of death. We've got every reason for recrimination and for retaliation. But if we do that, he said, South Africa will be a bloodbath. We will never have a united society. We will never get a society where people can live together. So go out there and let us practice the politics of reconciliation. And you know, the great thing about Mandela is there was no bitterness. 27 years in prison, he even invited his jailers and his prosecutors to his inauguration as president. He was prepared to forgive and forget and move on. And so he had a vision. And that, you know, leadership is about having a vision, giving people a hopeful vision. It can't be a negative vision. It's got to be about hope, being able to communicate it, which sometimes we fall down on, but that's what you've got to be able to do, and to bring people along with you. And it's really important that you create this idea that we're in this together. Now, Mandela did that, and I think he gives us a lesson about how to lead in the modern world. You've got to get your message across to people, and you've got to persuade people that by working together, you can achieve things that you can't do by just working in isolation on your own.
So we've been looking in this series, actually, Gordon, on 21st century survival skills, at the things that people wish they'd known when they were 21. And would that be on your list?
I think so. Look, you know, survival skills it sounds as if you know, it's life and death. And of course, if it's life and death, you've got to take big decisions. I think you've got to have a message of hope. You know, you think when you're in your 20s as you start off, you know, if I can only you know, learn this up and get detailed answers to these questions, and if I've got an interview that's coming my way, or if I'm doing an exam, if I can do all that, I think you've also got to think about the bigger purpose of what you're doing. And you sometimes it's difficult to stand back and say, well, you know, what am I trying to achieve, and how can we achieve what I'm trying to achieve, and are other people trying to achieve it with me? And I think you have got to have a sense of the bigger vision. You know, one of the books I read when I was at the university was Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, and it's a fascinating story because he was a great Catholic. He was a Christian who wanted to communicate a message. So how do you get this book, Clockwork Orange, which is about violence? It's about anybody who reads it, and I suppose less people have read it than have seen the film by Stanley Kubrick, Clockwork Orange. You've got this picture of a descent into violence and antisocial behavior, people actually doing things for all the wrong reasons. And so the book is actually nothing to do with Christian ethics. It seems a book that sort of is almost you know, glorifying violence. And then you find out that Anthony Burgess had written 20 chapters of that book. And then he'd written the 21st chapter, which was about redemption, that this young man who had been engaged in violence had seen the errors of his ways, he'd repented, he was changing, life was going to be different because what he'd done was wrong. And yet when they did the film, Stanley Kubrick, and when they did the American edition of the book, they only did chapters 1 to 20. and chapter 21 was completely missing. And the film missed out on 21 and ended on this violent note rather than on this note about redemption. So poor Burgess could not transmit the message he wanted to transmit. And he regretted that all his life. So you've got to be clear about the message you're trying to transmit. And it's usually a big idea. And what dominates what you want to do if you're 20 and 21, you're thinking of the next stage of your life. You've got to think, you know, stand back, you know, there is a bigger us, there is a bigger purpose. We've got to find a way of talking about the big picture, and the big picture matters.